History laid the foundation
that informs our conversation. Welcome to the classroom.
From the church to the streets, and even in the suites, and all around the world. I'm gonna keep it real in the classroom.
Fannie Lou's classroom. Fannie Lou's classroom. Fannie Lou's classroom.
Good afternoon, those of you who are tuning in to Fannie Lou's Classroom. We're super duper excited about, I say that every week, but I'm always excited about the amazing guests that we have on the show, and we're going to keep it rolling. You know, we kicked it off with Dr. Haynes to start off season 4, then we moved and shifted into Dr. Delman Coates and Lakeitha Anderson, who kept the conversation going. And today we're excited about our guest, and for some, I'm going to introduce her. Some of you have already become acquainted with her if you attended church on Sunday, and if you attended our annual Broughton Wells lecture series on last night. So we're excited to have Dr. Mingo with us. We're going to dish her in a matter of moments. But first, you know I have to always shout out and give credit to my amazing team that makes this happen every single week. We want to shout out Brooke, who is on our, I wouldn't say ones and twos because you mix and scratch over there, but she's our audio engineer. So we appreciate her coming up in the space and handling business every single Thursday. And I want to pause for a moment and say Rochelle Moore, who you know is part of our amazing team that got us started, is following her dreams, and she is relocated from Texas to another state, and we're super proud of Rochelle. She is going to do some amazing work in the film industry, and we look forward to seeing her projects in the future. So I want to shout out Rochelle because she was a part of getting this going. So we thank her for her service, not just to Fannie Lou's Classroom, but particularly to Friendship West Baptist Church in this branch of Zion. Now, of course, you know, I have Shanika and Cheryl, who not only do the classroom, but so many other things here at the church. So I guess we got to shout them out always. Shanika and Cheryl, who keeps this thing going. And Cheryl manages our amazing guests from week to week. So we're so appreciative of that. And I want to shout out Jessica, who is in the house today, who is her first time being in the classroom. She's part of our gender justice team. So she decided to stay on over and hang out with us a little more from last night into Thursday. And Kiara Haynes, who's also a part of our amazing gender justice team, is watching online. I'm sure she'll be popping in the chat, making some comments. She sent us some questions she wants to ask Dr. Mingo on today. So we're just here as always to have this dynamic learning community, to have conversations that really talk about this intersection of faith, politics, and race. And so we're excited once again to learn and grow together on today. So let me introduce our amazing guest. She is the Reverend Dr. AnneMarie Mingo. AnneMarie Mingo is an associate professor of ethics, culture, and moral leadership and director of the Metro Urban Institute at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. Drawn on oral histories and ethnographies, her work in social ethics centers on the lived experiences of Black church women who were involved in the civil rights movement. Her research interests include 20th and 21st century Black freedom struggles with a specific focus on the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, South African Apartheid Movement, the global movement for Black lives, socio-religious activism for Black women, and theological and ethical influence in social movements. Her first book, Have You Got Good Religion? Black Women's Faith, Courage, and Moral Leadership in the Civil Rights Movement, it says will be published with the University of Illinois Press in 2024, but it's already published. Yeah. And look, I just got to stop and say, this cover is dope.
It is, right?
This is a dope
we
cover.
Can talk about it.
We're going to talk about the cover, but more importantly, the information content inside is dope-er. I don't know if that's a word, but like my pastor, I'm going to make it up today. She also writes in the areas of Black church activism, peace, reconciliation, and the influence of Black music and media and social activism. She is the founder of Cultivating Courageous Resisters. Okay, I've got to change that. Resisters project that works collaboratively to expand the work and equip intergenerational religious activists to help meet critical contemporary needs for social justice. Listen, that's a portion of her bio. You can read the full bio in the description on YouTube under this title. But let's welcome the Reverend Dr. AnneMarie Mingo to the classroom.
I'm so excited to be here today and to spend some time with you all in Fannie Lou's classroom.
Yes, yes. So, let's just jump right in because we want to use our full time to really talk about a number of things.
Okay.
But I do want you to have an opportunity to talk about your text. And all of us have the book, but some of us just received it. But, I did jump in and do some of my seminary kind of going through, that seminary reading. And some things I want to pull out in here. And, others will have questions as well. But let's just start with the regular basic question. First, congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
So tell us about it. Just tell us in general about Have You Got Good Religion?
So the title may be familiar to a number of people. It comes out of our culture, out of our Black context, coming out of a spiritual and a movement song in many ways, right? So Have You Got Good Religion with the refrain of Certainly Lord, or actually Certainly Lord is often used as the title for it. And so as an ethicist, I'm concerned about the good.
Yeah.
I'm concerned about human flourishing. I'm concerned about living an abundant life. And so the play on the word of the good was important to me as something that I wanted our title to reflect. So looking at the good in that way, drawing from our cultural text and using this as a way in, because for me, it's a reflexive question. Right? Because if I'm asking, have you got good religion? Sure, an immediate response can be certainly, but we also need to check it and see.
Is it good?
Is the religion that I am living out right now leading to the good?
Right.
If not, I might need to make some adjustments and figure out, God, what would you have me to do?
Yes.
Right? Which is what the women in the book do. So they are using their faith as a way of pushing them into action so that they can make changes for the world that allow us to live what we are living right now. So that's a big part of the opening part of the title. But the next part is Black women's faith, courage, and moral leadership in the civil rights movement. So within that, I'm looking at the virtues that I lift up in the book. So freedom, faith becomes the first virtue. Courageous resistance becomes the second one. And then theomoral imagination, which becomes moral leadership in the title, becomes the next one. So this book offers a new set of virtue ethics that we can live by coming out of the Black community, coming out of the civil rights movement through the lived experiences of Black women. And so often in what we are taught, a lot of times when I go around and I'm talking to people about the civil rights movement and I say, name somebody from the civil rights movement, who y'all think they say?
Martin Luther King.
Martin Luther King, right? Who's the next person that they say? If they get to a woman, it's Rosa Parks.
Right.
But that's about it. But if we look at any of the images, any of the still pictures, any of the videos from most of the times of the movement, of the traditional civil rights movement, so we're talking about 1954-ish to 1968-ish, you got a whole lot of women.
Whole lot.
And I was trying to figure out, well, who are they? Right? Number one, who are they? But then two, what made them go out there and do that? Because for the most part, if you knew somebody, like even a Fannie Lou Hamer, right? She's known, but she also had at one point protections by being able to work for the movement. Right? So she's getting checks from SNCC and other spaces. I wanted to know about the women who didn't have that kind of cover. Who could have easily been fired from their jobs, and yet they did it anyway. What pushed them to do it? It was their faith. Right? And their courage to keep resisting despite what might come because they believed that what they were doing was bigger than themselves. So that's a big part of what this work becomes. And then, of course, we move into some contemporary aspects of it because I never want people to stay in history and not see how that applies to the present.
Right.
So that's why by the end of it, we begin working through this movement for Black Lives era and looking at those same virtues. Freedom, faith, courageous resistance, theomoral imagination in our contemporary moment of the 21st century.
There's so much just in you breaking down the title that we can really go into. So one of the things I want you to talk about, just what you just explained by way of the title, is was one aspect that is important. You're excavating, right, and preserving these stories of these women. So how do we prevent? So you're doing this work, so you're doing it here, but more broadly, and how can we be more intentional about making sure we don't have to have another Dr. AnneMarie Mingo 100 years later saying, oh, I had to excavate what happened during Black Lives Matter, right? How do we make sure women are not silenced, invisibilized, erased, and marginalized and pushed to the back? Because, so talk to us about the importance of how we make sure we honor the sacrifices that women are making even now, even those that we make that are not as well known, who don't have platform, who are out on the streets every day, working.
Do you mind if I shift that and start with how I did it for this? And
Yes,
then move
that's
into
perfect.
that,
Yes, let's
right?
do it.
So, as I'm saying, it mattered to me to find the women who were not protected per se. The everyday women. I call them everyday women in the text. And even when you were saying, oh, the cover, right?
Yes,
Because I actually commissioned this artwork. The artist is James Killings Jr. I sent him the introduction of my book and some pictures from the Library of Congress for context for the time period. And he created this. It was important to me to push the press to not just give me some standard photos, right? Or even some historic photos where somebody could say, oh, I already know Fannie Lou Hamer. I don't need to read that. Oh, I already know Ella Baker. I know all about her. I don't need to read that. I wanted people to say, oh, that could be me, or that could be my aunt, right? When they begin to look at the images, they could perhaps see themselves and want to know more. The other thing that does is it makes it a lot more relatable and accessible, that you didn't have to be the big, well-known one that somebody wrote about to have still participated and made an impact, because it took everybody. One time marching or 50 times marching, it took everybody to make these kind of changes. So I was intentional about going to try to find those women, which meant that I had to give them space to identify themselves as movement participants.
Right.
So a part of this, I was speaking earlier with Sister Cheryl, she's about to go get her IRB stuff accepted. When I was working on this for my dissertation, because this begins as the dissertation work and then gets expanded into this. But when I was doing the initial research as a part of the dissertation, I had to get approval through Emory University's Institutional Review Board, the IRB, to say this is who I'm going to go and talk to, and this is what I plan to do, right? They want to make sure. And especially because our people have been, unfortunately, researched in ways that were not ethical.
That's right.
That we are doing that and that we are clear about our process. And so I identified 4 churches that I was going to do the primary research in. So in Atlanta, Georgia, which is where half of the research takes place, it's at Ebenezer Baptist Church, well known, King's Church, King's Home Church, and then also Big Bethel AME Church. They're both located on Auburn Avenue in Atlanta. Major corridor in the 4th Ward of Atlanta, both significant historic churches, but 2 different denominations, right? African Methodist Episcopal and Baptist.
Right.
But I was also concerned to not only think about the movement from a Southern lens, because too often that's all that we're taught.
Yeah.
We only think about it South, and we often only think about it Baptist, because we allow a narrative to be shaped for us instead of going to try to understand what was really happening. So I decided, okay, well, I'll do this stuff in Atlanta, but I also want to look north. So as I looked north, I went to Harlem. And so I did research at Abyssinian Baptist Church and First AME Bethel, right? Okay. Same denominational alignment, about the same distance apart city to city, which allowed me to then tell the IRB, these are the spaces I'm going to go to look for people. But again, we're talking about, so I'm doing this in the 2000s, the 2010s and 12s and all of that stuff. Most of those women were older at the time, but none of them were under the same pastor that they would have been under at the time.
Yeah.
Which meant I couldn't just go and say, because Calvin Butts was still the pastor of Abyssinian at the time, I couldn't just go and say, well, Reverend Butts, tell me who all of your people are. He wasn't their pastor during the movement. I needed to let them identify themselves as being active. This, and I'm walking this out because this is a part of how we do it contemporarily too.
Yes,
right?
I hear you.
And so I would have announcements in the bulletin. Reverend Mingo is here doing research from Emory University. She's a student trying to work on her PhD, and they would have me stand up, and I would do my little wave, and then women would come to me after service and say, "Well, yeah, I got arrested one time. Well, yeah, I did a sit-in one time." Yeah, and so they identified themselves in that way. That's how the stories get reclaimed.
Yeah.
We don't make assumptions about who people are, where they're located, what they can do, what counts as activism in our mind. Give them the space to do it themselves, right? So that was critically important for me. From an academic space, I used grounded theory to do my work, which meant that I didn't go in with preconceptions around what was going to come out of the research. I let the research come up and the theories come up from the ground, from their language, from their interviews. And that's how I found the language that I ended up using. So I think that's also extremely important for us to not make assumptions about what somebody's going to tell us, because we've read a couple of books from a particular lens.
Right. Yes.
That's how we get shaped and formed if we do that. So that's how I did it historically. And I got beautiful stuff, which you'll be able to read in the book as a result of allowing women to identify themselves. I mentioned one briefly last night when I said, had a woman call, she literally left a voicemail. Well, I'm just a little old jailbird. I was like, who is she? I need to talk to this lady, right? And so I now call her Mama Bessie, but Bessie Smith Sellaway, who was a student at Spelman College at the time, who got arrested multiple times while she was there in Atlanta. Her pastor, Reverend Warnock, would not have known that. She wasn't a member of Ebenezer at that time. And he certainly would not have been the pastor, right? So again, giving people space to identify what they see as activism, what they see as a level of participation, and not thinking that it needs to be, I led it, to still be valid.
That's good.
Right? And so all of that matters. So that's how I did it historically, and that's how I would suggest that we have an opportunity to do that now in this contemporary moment, to allow people to identify themselves as being active in this moment and movement. I also, though, think, and in the spaces where I've worked with students and some of the more grassroots activists, thankfully, when I normally see people who are on the street and they're part of organizations that are doing activism, they normally have somebody who's there documenting. When I was a professor in a space where students didn't quite know that, and because of what I know about the movement, I would say everybody can't die for the die-in. Somebody needs to be assigned to document.
That's right. That's right.
This is an active part of what you are doing. Who's your person? And what I also would have to help them realize is there were times when we would be sitting there, and I'm out there as faculty, this is when I was at a different institution, as one of the only faculty persons that's out there doing die-ins with them and everything else. And I'm there, I said, I'm dying in, but my eyes going to be open because I need to see. And what I would see would be people from outside of the context coming in with their larger cameras, their ability to document. And I said, now, when you need this 25, 50 years from now, who's going to have it? Right? If you haven't already gone in and done it. Now, during the civil rights movement, we didn't necessarily have as much access to those types of resources. Getting a good camera was expensive, right? Having the ability to record something audibly even was expensive. So we get Martin Luther King Jr.'s first speech from the Montgomery Improvement Association because they borrow recording equipment from the college. Right? So they get up there going to Alabama State. They didn't have it within churches. People didn't just have it regularly. Today we've got better access.
Yes.
So we have to be intentional about making sure that we document it, that we develop archives that can become contemporary living archives now.
Yes.
So that people know where to go and find these types of things, and we give ourselves access. Because one of the things I will say, I've got a number of images that do show up in the book. I had to pay for most of those images out my pocket. Because I was determined to make sure that I could tell a story visually.
Yes.
But I didn't have any black folks that I was going to buy these images from.
Wow.
We didn't have it as much at the time.
Because the others were photographing.
Others were doing it, and they now capitalize on it.
Yes.
And we need the image
off of our folks.
Off of our stuff.
Yes.
Yeah. There's one person, and I won't name that person. I was intentional not to use any of those photos, because I think that person is taking advantage in ways that are horrible, in my opinion, right? And so even if it was a good shot, I wasn't going to get it from that person.
Right.
Not with the dollars that I had to put in, right? That, and I also was intentional to try to find images that were not so well known.
Yes, yes.
So you'll be able to see, like, there's an image in here of Prathia Hall. And she, I don't even know what page that's on in here, but she's actually having a conversation with some folks in Atlanta, and we normally see the one picture of her preaching.
Right.
But I'm like, she was doing a whole lot more. Look at her as a strategist, right? Look at her as the leader within this part of the Atlanta movement at this time, right? As a young person. So all of those things are intentional moves that I'm doing to try to expand our understanding of women's role within the civil rights movement.
Yeah, and I love that, because to your point, and I'm glad you really took the time to really walk us through that, because I want us to begin to see that in our own spaces and not see what people are doing in our spaces. We don't know, wait 20 years later to look back and say, oh yeah, I was there. Like, how can we appreciate what is happening before us and see the importance of documenting? Because sometimes I think what can happen, it's just normal, right? Oh, this is what we do. That's just Cheryl over there doing that, or Brooke is doing that, and not understand the importance of documenting what we see right in front of us. Yeah. Because somewhere down the line, to your point, that's going to be needed. Yeah. And I remember back in, I guess it was August, when I took a trip to Brazil with a few people, and we had one lady on our trip who was a journalist, but also a cultural anthropologist. And every time I just wasn't thinking. She said, no, you all need to take a picture here. We need to record this here. And, at one point I was like, why? When it was over and she began to show us all, I was like, oh. Because I think in the moment, we're just here, we're doing the work. And so to your point, I like how you did that, because I want us to start thinking that way about whatever space we're in, to honor what women are doing and not see it as that's just what women are supposed to do in the church, is serve. Right? That what we're doing is important and deserves to be documented, and not for the sake of getting credit, but it's served for the sake of saying what you are doing by way of commitment, showing courage, and being consistent with the work and moving the needle, right, in terms of issues that we deal with. So I think I'm glad you said that, because I think that's what's important.
I appreciate you noting that too. And I will note that for the most part, especially historically, most of these folks, and I was trying to point this out last night, they didn't know it was going to take this long. They didn't know it was even going to be successful. They weren't thinking, 50 years from now, somebody might want to see this. That wasn't the thought. They were in the moment, in the movement. The beauty of us now is that we have the wisdom to look back and learn from that.
That's right.
And make different kinds of choices today. But that also means that that's not everybody's role to document. But for those who it is, for those who are gifted in this area, that is what you give to the movement. That is what you give to the struggle, to be able to come in and to write the story, to be able to come in and to capture the video, to be able to come in and to have the eye for the stills to say, this is where you should be, right? And those become important markers of, it makes a difference if you're just standing in front of a tree or if you're standing in front of an angle where you get the monument to mark where you are. Those things matter.
That matters.
But there are people who are gifted in that, who can see it and can say, hey, let me just capture this real quick. Or they just get it. And it doesn't have to be for, hey, but we also need to know who has it.
Right.
So when the time comes and we actually need to reference something, we know where it is. And so that's why I'm mentioning the power of trying to start building some digital archives.
Yes.
Right? We can still make sure that we are giving credit to the persons who are capturing it. So we're not just trying to take from folks. We need to make sure that they're getting it, but we need some common spaces. There was an image from Ferguson that I wanted, and I couldn't find a good clean shot. I couldn't. I knew it existed, some kind of space and where, but I couldn't figure out where that was to be able to, and so we just need to know, where are these things? Who's bringing it together? Who's thinking about it as a part of the work, not just to be able to get quote unquote credit, even though we need to give credit. But it gets challenging when that becomes the only angle.
It was the only angle. And I'm gonna move on to some other questions, but I think, and you're saying this, and I say this all the time, even with Shanique and Shirley, they hear me say this often, and I say it in our ministry and to the church at large. When it comes to justice movements, and I love how you're even, earlier you're kind of pushing out also this notion of not having these hard definitions on what it means to be engaged in movements. Right, what activism looks like. It doesn't look one way.
Does not.
And because I do all the editing, I'm not in the streets, it doesn't mean because you protest that you're more dedicated to the movement than I am. So when I tell people, we need anything you can think of, the movement needs it. And so to your point, so it's identifying those people even in our spaces, whether it's congregation or whether it's a nonprofit we're a part of, or our own kind of, we're out in the streets trying to gather people at, what do you do well? What do you feel is your major gift you can add to it? Because never force fit someone, and let people know whatever you do is just as valuable. Because sometimes we'll put hierarchy, right, on what it means to be in movement and what role you play. So you're probably not the orator, but maybe you do the good writing.
Right.
And we need all of that.
Or you've got a list of people that if you call, they actually show up.
Hello.
That's important too.
Or people who can support.
You know somebody who can put some dollars towards this thing. Hello.
Yes.
You got some prayer warriors.
You need,
where every time that somebody's going out, you know that these 5 women are going to be praying until we get back and tell them. That's important. All of those things are important.
So important. And I think that shows the value in, and this is why I always press churches to be more deeply engaged and show people where it doesn't matter what our fine arts ministry. I always talk to Dr. Norfleet. They want to know how they're part of the movement. We need music. We need song. We need drama, things to, bring this to life. Like, that is very important to it. So it's always something we all can do. So I'm glad you said that, because I think we have to always repeat that, because I think some people can feel like, well, I mean, I don't really want to go protest. I really don't think I'm part of it. Oh, but what do you do? Well, talk to me.
Right.
What can you do? Do something. My biggest thing is do something and be a part to get us further down the road. So thank you for that. And thank you for explaining this cover because it is it's beautiful and it's dope. I was like, oh, I see. Yeah, and I like this idea of, because you really can't see the faces, identify them. So to your point, this could be my grandmother.
I remember when I first showed this to my mom said, I would probably be right over there.
See.
She saw a space for herself,
See?
right? And that was I hadn't told her how I was trying to have this.
Yeah.
I didn't exactly know how it was going to show up. Now, the artist and I sent him the stuff. He sent me video like, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I'm thinking I'm going to add a little bit
beautiful.
more so that I could see it. We changed some colors because I wanted it grounded in a particular way.
Yeah.
But yeah, I want to invite people in to this information as a way of equipping them to be able to do something today, learning from the past so we can apply it in the present and create a better future for all of us.
Yeah, so I'm going to shift now I'm going to go ahead and throw one of Kiara's questions out here. I'm going to say, this is a Kiara question as a newly graduate of seminary, because I could always identify with, because I know how I was coming down. I was like, oh, let me ask this question. So you have so much. So let me ask this one question she once said. She said, can you speak more to the religious Black woman's hermeneutic that you interview, those that you interview in your work, and how they understood a living God, regardless if it was preached to them on Sunday?
Yeah, so one of the things, thank you, Kiara, for the question. One of the things that I try to do in here is I use language of lived theology. So that because most of the women that I was studying, actually all of the women that I was studying, and most of the women who were doing things at that time period, they didn't have access to seminary.
Yeah.
But they had a clear understanding of who God is.
Come on, yes.
Right? And theology is our understanding of God.
Yes.
They understood, they had the clarity in their understanding of God through the living. Not because of the study per se to get access to those positions of power in these ivory towers, right? And so they worked out their theological understanding through songs, right? I want to come back to what you even just mentioned, and which is also why I use songs throughout the book to guide us, because that became a space, especially for the women, to be able to articulate a theology. Because in general, you wouldn't have people passing out hymn books, song sheets when they're sitting in the mass meetings. Songs were lifted up within the congregation. Somebody would lift up a verse and they would come, the call and response model of the Black church. Somebody would lift up a verse and then they would sing that. Then another would lift up. There are recordings that I have that are now housed by the Smithsonian of mass movements, and I hear the call out voices being women. They're not at the mic, so they weren't necessarily in the position of power.
Right.
But they were guiding and shaping our understanding of God because of how they were creating songs in that moment.
Yes.
That's the women's theology. That is their hermeneutic,
yes.
right? And so that was important for me to try to understand as I was interviewing the women. I said, well, give me some songs that remind you of the movement. And then I would get an understanding as to why. I also asked for them to name a scripture for me that reminds you of the movement. That's where I saw some shifts and differences between what we would generally think about for Black theology, where often the texts that we hear, not always, but very often the texts that we hear in some of the more traditional forms of Black liberation theology, they're often Exodus-oriented narratives, right? Or apocalyptic type narratives. God gonna come in and do. But these women, it wasn't about being pulled out of anything. It was about being kept in the thing. So they were drawing more from the Psalms and some other places where God was a present help with them in the midst of this. Not pulling them out, but keeping them within, right? That's how we get to see their understanding of God, because they trusted God to keep them to go day after day after day. I was pointing that out last night. How do you get from day one of a protest, of a bus boycott, to 381 days if you don't get the understanding that God is with me in the midst of this? That day after day, I can keep going because God is here with me in the midst. I'm not even expecting God to necessarily pull me out. I do want some change to happen, but I need to be kept
while in the midst of
this.
That's right.
So that I can keep going day after day. And that's what I get a chance to see and learn when you actually have conversations with them. I'm sitting in their houses, right? Yeah. Sitting, talking, and learning from them. And it was actually therapeutic for a number of them. They actually talked about that because a lot of them had not been spoken to. They didn't talk about some of the families didn't even know. Some of the families did not know the level of engagement of their folks because they hadn't really talked about it. And so when I'm in there asking these questions, they were able to sit back and think. and say, well, yeah, I would say this scripture, and why. And so all of that is what I would offer to Kiara as a part of this, and I hope that answers.
Yeah, you actually dug into. I was going to go to chapter 5, theologies of movements for liberation.
Okay, that's at the end, but yes.
Yeah, right. That caught my attention. Well, you already said it. What caught my attention was the different texts and scriptures that men would use and what women would turn to.
Yeah.
So you just explained that beautifully. So now I don't have to go there. But I wanted to read one thing that was in chapter 5.
I love it. Let's go.
So it's actually in it's the second paragraph, like the very first
Give me the page.
Well, this doesn't have, so it's 141.
Okay.
Yes, it should be 141.
Gotcha.
Yes. So I'm going down to the second paragraph, and it's lengthy, but I'm going to read it.
Okay.
So born out of the love of life for respect for creation and filled with resilience, hope, determination, and trust in the divine, Black faith has operated in many forms throughout the continent of Africa since the beginning of humanity. Black faith traveled with African explorers who made their way west to the soils of South Central and North America before European colonizers laid claim to the occupied lands and sought to exploit resources and eradicate long-standing peoples and cultures. Black faith was fully alive before Black women, men, and children were kidnapped and forcibly brought to the Americas and assumed to be without religion or faith traditions by white European Christians. And when I read it, I was like, let's go there. Because particularly, I'm speaking now in the context of Texas in particular.
Okay.
We talk about Bible Belt, and I tell people Texas is south geographically, but it's different than Mississippi, Alabama. It's still this Southwest kind. It's a different kind of place. But I still tell people also it's the buckle of the Bible Belt, and particularly what I call theologies that sanction enslavement, Black codes, Jim Crow, segregation, etc., exist so heavily that many Black preachers still preach it.
Wow.
And so it really does impact. Right, when you talk about justice movement, and we talk about Black church women who do, because I will look at all of us in this room and say we're the Black church women who are doing the work in a space. Well, we need to look to the Psalms, or we need to look to the Gospels, which I do quite often. They can tell you that we lift up in our ministry oftentimes, because it's a theology that says that we did not have anything till we came to America. That we are using this dualistic theology that says, all we care about is getting you saved and tell you how to live right. And that God cares nothing about between Sundays, right?
Right.
So when I read, I was like, yes, please, let's talk about that. That the level of faith in that our well-developed, what I would say, theology, who God was and who God was in the world was well understood.
Well before we were brought into this space.
Yes.
Well, I was also trying to note that we came before being brought.
That's right.
Right?
It was there.
That as the people who knew how to navigate well, we were here as explorers and other people before we were brought as enslaved people.
Yes.
So that was important to know without going into. So this is not me saying, let me map out all of history.
But it's important.
But let's be clear.
Let's be clear.
That number one, we came before that. And then two, even when we came during that time period of enslavement, we did not come as blank tablets.
That's right.
We came with faith.
Yes.
Right? We came with a clear understanding of God. We understood God as the sovereign one before we made it into this space, right? And so, which is also why the title matters to me. Mm-hmm. Because even our enslaved foreparents had to figure out, now, is this right? This religion don't feel right to me.
Come on.
Let me figure out something else. Let me go out to the hush harbor.
That's right.
So I can commune with the God that I know and understand.
That's right.
Right? Let me continue recognizing, even if we were to use that type of Exodus narrative, they saw themselves. So, right, we got some people using the same text who saw this is the promised land versus them understanding, oh, wait a minute, this is the period of enslavement.
Right.
So I'm still stuck in Egypt.
I'm still, right.
Right? And so they had to be critical in
That's
their
right.
understanding of even the texts that were being brought to them. And so a lot of times we will pay attention to, well, they just kind of went along with it. Not everybody.
Not everybody.
Not everybody. And in the way that I was trying to point that out last night, let's focus on the ones who
Exactly.
Let's focus there.
Let's focus there.
Let's focus there.
And
let's look to the Nat Turners and the Denmark VCs and the Sojourner Truths,
Yes.
and the Harriet Tubmans, and all of these other church folks
who helped them.
who helped. Yeah.
Right. And I'm glad you said, I remember Dr. Wright, Jeremiah Wright used to come and do our African-American Heritage Lecture Series every year. And that's one of the things he always stressed was we didn't come with, to your point, like the tabula rasa,
Right.
the blank slates. And that in song, everybody talking about heaven ain't going. Like
Listen.
they knew this was not the same.
We knew this was not the same.
And we tend to overlook that. And or we shame that, or we demonize it some kind of way. That if it's related to anything connected to African spirituality, something about it is devilish.
Which is so sad.
Yes.
Let's just say. I'll just say that
But
to be kind.
because that's a whole
Because it's a whole nother thing. That
Yes.
and we've got Christianity that is in the continent of Africa before it makes it to Europe.
long before.
So can we even work with that?
Start there,
You know,
right?
let's accept even for the faith that we claim.
Yes.
As critical and crucial for us, it was there on the continent before it made it into these spaces.
Yes.
Right? We also don't get a Jesus who can hide out in Egypt
Come
if he
on.
was blonde and blue-eyed.
No way.
You can't hide
You
for
cannot.
multiple years if that was the case.
You gonna stand
So
out,
we got
right.
some questions.
Right,
Right?
right.
That our sacred text calls us to ask.
Yes.
You know, so
No,
you're
you can,
laughing at me, but I'm for real.
No, they laughing as we
In agreement.
right, because we've had Dr. Tamara Lewis on here a number of times, really talking about that, right? Because I'm intentional about always making sure we have an episode dedicated to recovering, returning to and recovering that which was already there, up and against fighting me. Well, you go back and read.
I can read.
I'm
Even
saying
even
just-
some of the people that are deemed as the church fathers, they were on the darn continent of Africa.
Hello,
Like,
hello.
people can't. That's that.
They're North African.
They're North African.
You can't
Writing
escape it.
and doing this
That's
original
right.
work.
And think exactly, and how we claim that and not allow it to be claimed by others. And I want to go into my whole story in seminary. I thought I was going to get put out of class when they were asking about African, not African. They asked, can we think of any early church fathers that may have been African? So I'm looking around. I was like, the ones you just named,
Right.
right? He was like, so everybody's looking at me. I'm looking at them like, what?
Right. Let's look at geography. Like these things matter, and we've got that as a part of our heritage.
Yes, and we need
Right?
to lay
a part
claim
of our
to
history
that.
and a part of our heritage.
Yes.
that good teaching can help us to embrace.
Yes, and
Right,
I think it's so
and to not have the fears that other people have placed on us, as you talk about. Well, I don't know about that.
Yes.
Why don't you?
What?
Right? I don't know. They talking about the ancestors. They do in the Bible.
Come on, you
That-
read
that's-
it in
this
12
is
and
exactly
1.
what you're reading.
Hebrews 12. You've read it.
You've read it. Not even just Hebrews 12. You've read it throughout. How they
If
gonna
you
go
read
and get
your-
the bones and bring them with you? Why? Because that mattered, right?
It's
Like,
right. That's
these are-
right.
This
That's
is
right.
our sacred text.
That's right.
That is aligned with our being as people. God knew this, and
Yes.
God knows that and loves it. So anyway,
No, but that's so important though, and I think that's why I'm saying that's why I think your text is. And I really look forward to really digging into it. Why it's so important to hear from those Black church women because they are drawn on a particular kind of faith and a particular kind of God.
yeah.
That we have, in my estimation, many of us have gotten away from because we have bought into this more, this continuous dualist theology, right? That we don't need to worry about any of that. God is love.
Well, you know what? There was a lot of that back then too. But and they still saw something different, right? So
Yeah.
there's this one piece that I talk about in here of a woman. She was in the Birmingham area. Marjorie Wallace Smith is her name. She still lives right now in New York City. And she talks about being very young, like 5, 6, 7, and having an experience walking to church. She says, we were walking to church school. And she said, I couldn't figure out how these kids, because she was walking past, she and her friends were walking past a white church, and they were calling them names, right? Slurs, derogatory names, similar to what I was preaching about the other day, right? It was intentional. It was
Right,
known.
right.
They were calling them names. And so she goes on to her church school, going to Sunday school, comes back home and asks her dad, she said, well, now, they must have a different God than our God.
See?
How could we have the same God?
How could we?
Must have a different God. This is her wrestling with a theological question. 5, 6, 7, 8. She's young,
Yeah.
right? But these are the type of women who said, "Well, no, because the God that I'm serving, I've been taught that it's a God of love, but also a God that wouldn't allow that type of thing.
That's
so let me
right.
try to figure out something that I can work along with God to make things better."
For sure. Yes, I just think that's another critical point as we, as Black church women, still are trying to do this work in church context. Many have, for various reasons, are doing this work without sanctuary.
Yeah.
They've decided, I can't do it in the space, right? And so, obviously, we're still here because I still believe that it can be done internally. I just think we also just have to be willing to have assumptions challenged and shed, and it allows us to be cleansed of really toxic theology that we have been taught and passed down, and how we take that off. And we input something new, like, clear, as we think about the songs, creating me a clean heart and renewing me a right spirit, or some say put in me a right spirit, right? So I think that's so important, and to honor Black church and to see not just the contributions and the sacrifices, but to really see the ways in which Black church women are still trying to be, to morally lead in a way that can move us to something greater. And not just for us, but for everyone. It's almost like that third womanist tenet, right? This whole idea of a traditional communalism, that it is for us. We want everyone to survive and thrive.
Yep. Survival and wholeness of all people.
Of everyone.
Yeah.
But understand it won't be at my expense, right?
which is a difference. And I'm
Yes.
thankful for that we are using enough wisdom today to say, okay, this is necessary, but
Yes.
you're not going to take me out in the
Not
process.
going to take me out in the process.
Right? I'm going to, if I need to be separatist
That's right.
at times for
That's
health and
right.
well-being,
That's
I'm going to
right.
do that to just take care of myself. And then I'm going to get back in the fight. One of the other things that I will note in this contemporary part of the movement, so moving in that chapter
Yes.
that you wanted to go to, is one of the differences that I'm thankful to see in this current moment is that we don't have, especially sisters, thinking that they have to do it all.
Yes, yes.
But they recognize that we're going to create this team, this larger group of people who all have a role to play. So that if I do need to tap out for a moment,
That's right.
the work doesn't just stop. It keeps going because somebody else has tapped in, because they've now replenished and rested enough themselves to be able
That's
to keep
right.
going. That's something that many of the contemporary movement folks have learned, having watched what happened in the past. They recognize, I don't want to just have a singular leader that they can pick off.
That's
and
right.
then that's it.
That's
But I
right.
also don't want to lose myself or my mind and my mental health and well-being because I've stayed in for too long without respite. So when we see these things like the NAP ministry and other spaces,
Right.
it helps
Right.
us to remember that that's a part of the work too, the caring for ourselves and trusting that the work's going to keep going.
It's going to keep
It
going.
doesn't have to just be me.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
Because that's some ego stuff if we think that it does.
Hello. And it's also honor, and it's for others to see that when I say I need to step away, I'm stepping away. And I know sometimes, I know like with Shnika, some days I'm like, you know what, let's just call it a day. It's a lot going on. We need to step away for a moment. Because that's what you need, because this type of work, it's non-stop.
Unfortunately.
And it keeps going,
right?
unfortunately.
Injustice is too far. It's all
It's
over.
everywhere.
So it's always there.
Always.
And I long for a day when it's not. But in our current reality, it is.
Yes, in our current
and
reality.
so we have to care for ourselves in the process while also equipping others to do the work.
Hello.
And so that's why that earlier part of the conversation of helping people to see how they can enter in
Yes.
matters. And that whatever level it is
Whatever.
makes a difference.
A big
Literally.
difference. Because one person can't do it
Cannot
all.
do it all.
So I think that's so important. And I think that's why it's important. 'Cause I heard you when you said you talked to the women, and for some of them it was therapeutic. Having not been able to maybe talk to someone, or maybe sometimes, I know in some families you have to be silent about what happened and what took place in families. So I think that, to your point, I love this new way we're in to say, it's okay, let's talk about it. Let's go get therapy. Let's talk to a therapist. Let's have sister circles, right? And I also think about Ida Bell Wells and others who had their clubs,
Yeah.
the women's clubs, like ways to at least be in community with each other. And that's something I was like, we should really, I'm sure some people do them in some kind of way, but I was like, I would really love to create something like a women's club that's somewhere where we do have an opportunity to sit and to be, but also we could use those opportunities to really shape movements and really support movements, right? Just how we kind of bring us all together as a collective. and because we're not against each other, we're not in competition with each other.
Well, and to find the different areas that we can do work. It doesn't
Yes.
all have to be exactly
That's
the same.
right.
I did appreciate your recent episode and the way that Delman Coates was able to map out and think about like what's the wedge at you, what are
Yes,
these things
yes,
going to be?
yes, yes.
So that if we have some clarity around something, we might take
Yes.
different approaches, but we're at least all pushing
That's
towards
right.
one thing. We do have some of that was happening in the past, but they also had multiple issues that they were working on.
Yeah.
Because we got a lot of issues.
got a lot of issues.
Right? So there are organizations, we know that. There
Yeah.
are organizations that are doing stuff. Many in this room are part of organizations that are doing things.
Yes.
Figuring out how we can get a little bit more alignment and clarity around, okay, for the next 10 years,
Yes.
this is our focus.
What is that
right?
focus?
Because a part of my personal belief is that a part of our challenge is that we are very reactive. And so, oh my gosh, this thing just happened. Let's go do this. Oh my goodness, this is about to happen. Let's go do this.
Yeah.
Instead of thinking longer term. So over the past summer, I was doing a piece with African Lutheran something group. I forgot what the actual title is. But so I did their keynote, and then I did a workshop. And in the workshop, I tried to start helping them map out a 50-year plan for an issue that mattered to them in the community where they served. And they initially were looking at me, 50, yes, this is actually what it takes. And if we look at those who've been able to make some of these changes, they literally had a 50-year plan. There was a 50-year plan to undo Dobbs, right? There was a 50-year plan to be able to get at these voting rights. 50 years, and they were patient, and they were diligent and strategic. We've got to be just as diligent
That's
and
right.
strategic about the things that matter to us and our people. And we know that when we do that, we actually do make things better for everybody else.
Right.
But we have to
Right.
think beyond reacting and think about, okay, how do we begin to put something in place? So these club, or getting back to a club type movement time period, may be one of those ways where within those different organizations, we say, okay, well then who are we training to be the next
right.
superintendent?
Hello. Yes.
Right? Who are we training to be the next judge? If it's going to take this long, who are we already having conversations with as young people to make sure that they're going to the
Yes.
particular type of law schools, that they're getting exposure within our communities to understand what matters, so that when they get into those positions, we know that they're going to do right.
Right.
Right? But that's not this person is about to be.
Right.
No, we got to start
Right.
nurturing folks
That's
along
right.
the way.
That's right.
And educating and equipping folks so that when they get to that stage, they're actually doing the right work and they aren't bought off easily. They aren't tempted by other things, but
Yes.
that we've been making the plan and checking the boxes and figuring out what's it going to take.
And that's also transformative work, right? And leadership, because it is to say that we're not transactional. We're not getting this to get something done and move on. We're saying we see a longer goal here. And that might mean, and to your point, that has to be less ego, because it also may be the case. I'll just use myself for example. I may say, well, Danielle, okay, you're probably not going to see this change in your lifetime, but I'm going to go just as hard as if I will.
Absolutely.
So some of this also, we need to know it may not be for you to enjoy the fruits of that. And I always tell people, you enjoying the fruits of something somebody didn't enjoy the fruits of.
Absolutely.
So that's that's the journey. That's the
Absolutely.
journey of life.
And
Not-
who else are we bringing along
That's
with us
right.
with this?
That's right.
So that again, it is not out as the lone person in the front, but that you are bringing other people with you, even as you push the work, even if you don't get to see it.
That's
but you at least
right.
are talking about it. So let me
Yes.
switch back to something that you said earlier about the contemporary women. How do we make sure that those narratives are not lost?
Yes.
Right? How do we make sure? And I don't believe that anybody is silenced. I just don't think that their voices get prioritized, right? Or that we don't value. But most of
Yeah.
us have the ability to speak. Like there are some people who are actually mute, but that's few and far between. Most of us have that ability. We don't necessarily have the support that would show that it has been
Yeah.
valued and it gets lifted up, right?
Yeah.
So that's for us to be able to do, to be
Yeah.
able to figure out spaces like this, Fannie Lou's classroom, and to figure out how do we get this out more? How do we get some more grassroots folks into here?
Yeah.
How do we set up something that is not maybe necessarily in here, but we do a live broadcast in a space where there are some people so that we can get their voices, right? As a part of recognizing and saying, sis, I see what you're doing,
Yeah.
right? I want to be able to bring this to our space, bringing in, you've been naming folks, we've been naming folks. How do we bring them in? That's how we keep their voices alive. So that if somebody hears the name of somebody who's an activist here in Dallas and they then begin to look them up and follow them on whatever social media. That keeps their voices in a space that it gets elevated. We can do this.
Yeah,
We can.
sure.
It's not super hard,
No,
but it
right.
does take intention.
Right? Planning and strategy,
it takes planning
and being
and
clear
strategy
about
and being intentional.
what you're doing.
And looking for the people. Looking for them wherever they are, right? They may not be the ones that have all the light shining around them.
Yeah.
Most of the time, the folks who are actually doing the work don't. They don't even want that.
Right, because they're doing the work.
They're doing the work. And they don't want the attention to get away from the work because of that, right?
But I just feel, and those are the folks I'm like, I'm still going to say your name because it's important people to know still, right? So you just giving me should have gave me that idea. Now I got to think where I'm going to go live in the community somewhere. Set up outside, not in summer. But so we have 10 minutes left. So what I would like to do, because I'm just a big, she's another one of my sheroes, Prathia Hall Wynn. Yes. So, of course, you have Freedom, Faith, and Chapter, I think it's Chapter 2. Yes. And then behind that, you do something on her as a moral leader. So just tell the people, who was Prathia Hall and why was she important for you to lift up freedom, faith as a virtue, right? And also give her that shine as a moral exemplar.
So, again, because I use grounded theory, I'm drawing from what the women are saying. And this idea around freedom that I could connect to faith was what the women, I interviewed, over 40-something women that were everyday women. And so when I was then looking for, well, what can I connect that with? What Prathia Hall does is she doesn't necessarily just create freedom faith. She also draws from the people in Southwest Georgia. And so Prathia Hall, born and raised in Philadelphia, daughter of a pastor, had been doing activist work herself as a young person, shaped with some other types of liberation type work, but she wanted to do even more. And her father was like, no, you can't go to the South. You can do this stuff up here in the Northeast, but we're not sending you to the South. But once her father passed, she told her mom, I'm going to go on down here anyway, right? And so she had those commitments from her understanding of faith that things needed to be better for other people. And so she makes her way into Southwest Georgia. She's there in Albany and a number of other spaces. And she is a preacher. A preacher's preacher, right? And so we now are hearing Prathia Hall's name more because of making the connection to the prayers that she and another woman, so I name all of this in the book, were praying that Martin Luther King Jr. hears with this refrain of, I have a dream. And he tells her, from what some other people have been able to capture, he tells her, I'm going to use this. And he does.
And he does, right?
So he uses it in Detroit before he uses it at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. But he's also known for saying, Prathia Hall is the one person I don't want to come after in the pulpit. Because she was that dynamic of a preacher, of a mover, right? Of an orator, that she could actually articulate the needs of the people in ways that drew them in. And he says, she's the one person I don't want to come after, right? But she gets this freedom faith by listening to the people who say, you can call me all of these things if you want to, but I'm going to trust God to take me down there to try to register, and I'm going to trust God to bring me back, right? And so because she's articulating this out of the experience of the people, and it mirrored what the women were telling me, then freedom faith became one of those virtues, because we've got too many spaces within the lived experiences of the people in the movement that says, this is how we did it. Yeah. Freedom has always been the goal. And our method of getting there is through our faith. And so that's a part of how the freedom faith really comes together. And we've got new stuff that we're learning about Prathia Hall, and I'm thankful for that. But she was also an ethicist. So that was important for me, that she's not only a civil rights movement person, she's not only a preacher, but she was also an ethicist. So she does her PhD at Princeton Theological Seminary. She was a professor there, professor at Boston, professor with you. So all of that mattered to me also, to lift this type of a woman who could shape our understanding of what the faith could allow us to do, could enable us to do in this pursuit of freedom that has always been the goal.
Okay. So my last question is more about you. So you sat with over 40 Black church women. Yeah. And I'm sure you heard, I know a whole lot didn't make it.
There's a lot
in here.
That's not in the book. Absolutely.
So, but tell us, how did it impact you and what changed about you? Either in terms of maybe how you teach, how you preach, how you see yourself in the world as a Black woman, having to have that experience with the women.
That is such a great question. I'll speak to the way that it shapes my teaching, and then I'll try to get to me. But I almost always, whenever I teach a class around the civil rights movement, I have my students go and do oral history interviews. because the people are still here. So in the way that I was able to find folks, I'm like, go find the people in your community. Ask your mama, ask your grandmama, ask your great-grandma, because people are getting older. But, you know, they're still with us. Go sit with them and learn before those things are gone.
Yeah.
As I was doing the research, I was chasing the clock. Some of the women that I interviewed are no longer with us in physical form. They have passed on. And I knew that. But I also wanted to honor them as best as possible.
Yeah.
And to listen as fully as possible. So for all of the communities, I didn't just go in and say, I'm here today, I'm going to be gone by next Wednesday, can you just tell me everything? No, I went and lived in those communities. I would live in New York for 2 months at a time, walking the same spaces, going and sitting in the meetings, all of that stuff, to get to know them as people, because that mattered, right? And so that's just a part of who I am. I'm raised in the South. This is a part of who I like sitting with older women. They got wisdom.
They do.
Why in the world would we ignore that? And it's valuable to me. And that's a part of just who I am. And it also shapes the way that I approach scholarship. Because very often women's voices like these didn't have access to be written. And so Katie Geneva Cannon talks about how when she was doing her work, when she was, you know, first working on her PhD, how she was told, well, that's not written anywhere. I don't believe that to be true. And so she had to use, and she and some of our earlier womanist sheroes had to use literature that was, you know, drawing from other spaces, because at least it was in a book.
It was in a book, right.
I wanted to make sure that I captured the lived experiences of real people, so I named them as real people in the book. So that shapes me too.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, they gave me a little bit more faith to keep on going.
Come on, yeah.
Because they weren't doing it for the recognition.
Yeah.
So even in the work that I do, a lot of folks don't know what I'm doing out in the streets and trying to train and coach people and get them ready because of how I've studied to make them better and stronger. But I get that from my women.
Yeah.
You know, from understanding. And when, you know, there's a person that I'll be, I'm headed to Boston next week, and one of the women who lives in New York is going to come and join me and be there. And she talks just very casually. Well, yeah, well, you know, Miss Hamer would tell me to do such and such and such and such.
Wow.
Miss Baker would tell, because these were just the people.
Because of them, yeah,
that was just, those were just the people.
Right.
But what I get to hear in that is that there were always folks a little bit older with different experience that could tell the younger folks who were on the ground some of the better ways to do stuff. So in some spaces, when I've been working with undergrads and others, I am at that point, that age, where I'm the voice.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Mingo said that we need to put our heads this way, so that if somebody walks by, they don't step on. Like, I would physically be doing that type of work. So that's a part of how this ends up shaping me as a scholar. But then their faith it was untouchable. And that's probably the most exciting thing to me, to be able to see it get articulated at very young ages for most of them, but to then see it landing all the way through, because most of these women are still active today, one way or the other.
Something.
They're still
because
doing
it's part of who they are.
It's a part of who they are. It's a part of how they understand God
And what that means
and
to
what
be
that
Christian
means
to
for them. Exactly.
Yes.
And so that was a big part of me. How is it that your faith pushes you to act?
Yes.
And the action are the ethics. The faith is the theology. So how does your theology inform your ethics? This is what we get with Have You Got Good Religion? Black women's faith, courage, and moral leadership in the civil rights movement.
Yeah. Thank you. Hey, I don't know what else to say other than we need you back for a part 2.
Yes.
Thank you so
To
much
keep
for
the
having me in the
conversation
space.
going.
I am
Yes.
physically in the classroom. I'm hyped.
Let's thank Dr. AnneMarie Mingo for being with us today. We appreciate such rich conversation, dialogue, and wisdom was shared in this space. And that's what we want it to be, a dynamic learning community. We're learning and talking to one another. And I hope those of you who are watching, you share this video with those who may not be in the classroom on today. And make sure you like us on Instagram, like us on Facebook, and make sure they subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the notification bell so you can know whenever we go live. So just a couple of announcements. You know, I'm trying to do all these church announcements. We don't want to get lengthy. So all I have for you today is, you heard Dr. Mingo, you heard Dr. Delmont Coates, Lakeitha Anderson, Dr. Haynes. We need your support. And so a way you can support us is to buy a Fannie Lou Classroom t-shirt. If you're watching, you can just simply scan the QR code. If you are on your phone, just go to friendshipwest.org/ /justice, and you will see a link to purchase your Family Classroom t-shirt. That helps support the work that we do here in the classroom. Super excited about next week's episode. I know y'all say you always super excited, because I am. Yeah. It's just an amazing time we have in the classroom. We're going to have who I call my co-conspirator, my comrade, and my co-author, Reverend Dr. Reginald Williams Jr. will be with us. And we're going to have a conversation around the power of ancestry. Black sainted figures and spirit-filled revolutionaries. In the spirit of coming up on Resurrection Sunday, we want to have this conversation, which really kind of help us extend what we're talking about on today in some ways with Brother Reggie. So make sure you tune in on next week, and make sure you let everyone know to tune in with you at 12 o'clock noon. Come and get you some different type of food for lunch that can certainly feed your soul and you nurture your spirit. Thank you for being in the classroom today. We look forward to seeing you next week, 12 o'clock noon.
From the church house.